Right, shall we make a start? Welcome back, everyone, to the first panel of today's event. The panel is entitled Working Towards a Global Index on Naturalization Policies. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Jelena Jankic. I'm part-time professor at the Global Governance Program at the Schuman Centre and co-director of the Global Cit Observatory. I'll moderate this session in which the speaker is the convener of this workshop, Emilien Farc, Max Weber Fellow at the UI, who's also associated with the Global Citizenship Research Area, and Liav Orgad's Global Citizenship Governance Program. In addition to Emilien, we would like to welcome here two wonderful discussants, Isolde Honohan from UCD and Martin Roos from the EUI's Migration Policy Center. We'll start by Emilien's presentation of 25 minutes, after which I will hand over to Isolde and Martin, who will comment on his paper for 10 minutes each. Now, after giving Emilien the chance to respond to their comments, I will open up the session to Q&A from the audience. We'll try to wrap the session up at 1:30 sharp so as to not stand between anyone and their lunch. So without further ado, I give the floor to Emilien.
Thank you very much, Jelena. Yes, so before I start, I'd like to thank you for accepting to chair this panel, and thank Isolde and Martin too for accepting to discuss my paper. So your own work on the comparison of citizenship and migration policies is a great source of inspiration in this project. So it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to exchange with the three of you today. So let me just share my screen. All right. Can you see it? Perfect. All right, so in this talk, I'd like to synthesize the ambitions of my project presented in more detail in my working paper, which I'm very happy to circulate to anyone interested. And I'll explain some of the questions and difficulties that I'm still struggling with. The general ambition of my project is to work towards a systematic comparative explanation of policy variation in citizenship acquisition beyond Western democratic countries. As of now, available research on citizenship acquisition has largely focused on these countries. However, naturalization matters to significant proportions of immigrants in the global south too, as the recent forum contribution, coordinated by Bronwyn Memby and Rainer Barbach on the Global Cit website, points out. Further understanding the determinants of the degree of inclusivity or restriction of citizenship regimes towards immigrants is thus a scientific enterprise whose impact is not limited to the Western world. The expansion of the comparative perspective that I propose is theoretically driven and aims to explore a range of hypotheses likely to explain policy variation in citizenship acquisition in a more comprehensive manner than was the case in previous research. So in the present state of my project, I identified two main variables. I intend to concentrate on the impact of nation-state formation on the degree of inclusivity of naturalization regimes, with a particular attention to colonial legacies, and on the impact of political regimes. So classical comparative theories within the field of citizenship studies have stressed the importance of these two variables. Rogers-Brubaker's famous comparison between the French and German citizenship regimes, for example, pointed to nation-state building processes as key determinant factors that had a long-lasting impact on the institutions of these two countries. A number of scholars, such as Mark Moshe Howard or Thomas Janowski, have identified colonialism as another key aspect related to nation-state formation that is likely to impact the degree of inclusivity of naturalization regimes. While other scholars, such as Christian Japke and Martin Reus, have claimed that the way the state is politically organized affects the degree of inclusivity of its citizenship policies towards immigrants. I won't come back on the rationale behind these theories here, but I'm happy to come back on this point in the Q&A. Recently, Ruud Koopmans and Ines Michalowski have drawn on these classical comparative theories within the field of citizenship studies and tested them, expanding the comparative scope to non-Western immigration countries. Building on this research while pushing it further, I suggest that there is a case for testing some of the hypotheses that Koopmans and Michalowski have examined in a more comprehensive way. And I want to do so by focusing exclusively on citizenship acquisition policies, meaning citizenship acquisition policies towards immigrants, meaning residence-based naturalization and birthright citizenship acquisition. And by expanding the comparative scope to cover more countries with poor democratic performance, along with more former colonies. I thus make 5 distinct hypotheses in relation to the 2 variables that I have distinguished. In relation to nation-state building processes, I make one single hypothesis that, except for a few cases, mostly applies to European countries, because the nation-state building theories that I've mentioned do not fully apply outside Europe. So the first hypothesis is that nation-states that have emerged from state-seeking secessionist or national unification movements will evidence more restrictive citizenship acquisition policies than nation-states with long-standing territorial sovereignty. In relation to colonial heritage, I make 2 related hypotheses drawing on the theories developed by Howard and Janowski. The first one is that former colonial powers, and these include Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Spain, or the UK, former colonial powers will evidence more inclusive citizenship acquisition policies compared with countries that have no pre-existing ties to their immigrant populations. The second hypothesis related to colonial heritage is that long-standing settler countries, including Australia, Canada, the US, but also Latin American countries such as Argentina, Venezuela, or even Asian countries as Singapore, will have more inclusive citizenship acquisition policies compared with countries that have only recently begun to be confronted with mass immigration. I add another hypothesis that applies specifically to former colonies. Scholars have shown that in many post-colonial states formed after World War II, especially in Africa, the citizenship legislations that have been elaborated after independence have largely followed the model of the former colonizing power. In her analysis of citizenship regimes in Africa, Bronwyn Memby further suggests that countries with a common law tradition tend to follow a more discretionary approach to nationality administration than countries with a civil law tradition, as is the case, for example, in the former French and Belgian territories. So it will be interesting to evaluate whether such institutional legacies still have an impact on contemporary citizenship acquisition policies. I thus make the following hypothesis: more or less inclusive rules pertaining to citizenship acquisition for immigrants within former colonies can be traced back to institutional models inherited from former colonizing powers. Finally, regarding political regimes, I expect that states evidencing high levels of democratic performance will have more inclusive naturalization policies compared to states evidencing poor levels of democratic performance. So there are certainly more variables that we may want to test on a large number of countries from different continents. And in a previous presentation of my project, Reino Barbach took the example of Austria to point out that political regimes and trajectories of nationhood cannot explain the restrictiveness of this country's citizenship acquisition policies. One needs to look at the politics of citizenship and immigration and the strength of far-right political parties in particular to make sense of the specific case of Austria. I take this point and I'm currently searching ways to incorporate this variable in my research design. Now, can we draw on the policy indices on citizenship acquisition currently available in literature to test this hypothesis in a larger number of national settings than what previous research has already done? Or should we develop a new policy index? So these are the questions that I address in the second section of my working paper, and I suggest that it's more interesting to expand on existing policy indices, and this for two main reasons. First of all, scholars have noticed a tendency to index proliferation and little momentum in the accumulation of knowledge to build on previous research. And bearing those criticisms in mind, I will pay attention to issues of concept measurement and dimensionality, on which Martin came back in his keynote, and that researchers have identified in the operationalization of existing indices. The second reason is that recently two policy indices have moved their comparative scope beyond Western democracies and now cover a wide range of cases worldwide. So these are, first of all, the indicators for citizenship rights of immigrants, ICRI, developed by Rup Koopmans and Ines Michalowski. So recently expanded to 29 countries worldwide, as you can see on the slide. And the second one is the Migrant Integration Policy Index, MIPEC, developed by the Migration Policy Group, that now covers 52 countries across the globe, so the countries that appear on the slide. So that MIPEC is now the policy index on citizenship acquisition with the largest comparative scope. And these two indices, I argue, can serve as springboards for further empirical investigations. That being said, I identify a number of dimensions of citizenship acquisition, of the citizenship acquisition process, and also eligibility conditions for naturalization that the most recent versions of ICRI and MIPEC have somehow overlooked, and that would be important to capture in order to provide a better view of policy variation across contexts. These include, first of all, procedural guarantees, such as the possibility to ask for judicial review or the existence of a maximum duration of procedure. Second, legal provisions making citizenship acquisition either a discretionary process or an entitlement. And third, a set of eligibility conditions for naturalization, such as good health requirements, discriminations based on ethnicity or nationality, discriminations based on gender identities and sexual orientations, and also the fees that immigrants are usually required to pay to apply for citizenship. So on the slide is a table presenting the different dimensions of the citizenship acquisition process and also eligibility conditions for naturalization that I think should and could realistically be covered in a global perspective. And as you can see, special naturalization provisions for spouses or refugees, as well as naturalization rates and implementation would be left aside for reasons that I further elaborate in the working paper that have to do either with difficulties related to data collection or concept measurement. I choose to expand on the latest version of MyPEX as the index that covers the most important number of countries and the rules for citizenship acquisition, and that is also the most comprehensive in its content, even if it's been simplified compared to its 2015 version. The first step of my project consists in adding more cases to MyPEX 2020. In a second step, I aim to incorporate the dimensions of citizenship acquisition that I've just identified as important in this table, adding a few more indicators to MyPEX. But how do I intend to select the countries that I would like to add to MyPEX 2020, and where do I find empirical data on these countries? So drawing on Koopmans and Michalowski, I focus on immigration countries as countries where the broad societal context for the regulation of citizenship acquisition is most similar. I follow Koopmans and Michalowski's definition of immigration countries as countries with, I quote, an absolute number of immigrants of at least 250,000 of people and the population share of at least 0.5%. 16 cases from the MyPEX 2020 sample do not pass the immigration country test and will be left aside. I'm aware that this immigration country test might be criticized for leaving interesting cases aside, including countries where immigration and access to citizenship are subject to intense politicization, but where the proportion of immigrants is relatively low, as is the case in India, for example. To mitigate this, I will run a separate analysis in which I will include the cases from MyPEX 2020 that do not pass the immigration test and see how this affects my results. Another possibility is to use immigration salience as another criterion for case selection, but this variable is quite hard to operationalize on a large number of cases. Any thoughts on these questions are very welcome in any case. To operationalize the political regime variable, I draw on the VDEM electoral democracy index as a prime indicator of the quality of democracy, as well as on the VDEM liberal democracy index for the period that extends from 2007 to 2019. That is the same period as in MyPEX 2020. So the VDEM electoral democracy index measures the extent to which national elections can be considered as free, fair, and competitive, while the VDEM liberal democracy index provides a classification of countries along three key characteristics, namely equality before the law and individual liberty, judicial constraints on the executive, and legislative constraints on the executive. And these three characteristics are directly related to the hypothesis that I have formulated in relation to political regimes. So following the categorization established by Luhmann and others, based on these two VDEM indices, I distinguish between four groups of countries. First of all, closed autocracies. So these are countries characterized by the absence of a multi-party electoral system and also the absence of free and fair elections. Second, electoral autocracies. So in these countries, we can find a multi-party electoral system, but elections can hardly be considered as free and fair. Third, electoral democracies. So countries where elections can be considered as free, fair, and competitive, but where the key characteristics of a liberal democratic regime are missing. And finally, liberal democracies, so countries that meet the standards of a liberal democratic regime, and where elections can be considered as free, fair, and competitive. So as the table on the slide shows, although ICRI and ICRI 2017 and MyPEX 2020 have enlarged their comparative perspective compared to previous editions, the number of countries with poor democratic performance, so closed autocracies and electoral autocracies, is still relatively low. So the number is 5 in each index. I aim to increase the number of these countries to reach a more balanced distribution of cases between the 4 groups of countries that I have differentiated. And as I explained in the working paper, adding the cases that featured in ICRI 2017 to the MyPEX 2020 sample does not really help in this respect, but it's nevertheless a first step in that direction. As far as trajectories of nationhood and experiences with colonialism are concerned, and this is the second variable that I intend to test, I aim to increase the pool of former colonies to compared to ICRI and MyPEX, and I propose to add at least 5 to 6 countries that did not feature neither in MyPEX 2020 nor in ICRI 2017. If I manage to concentrate on countries with poor democratic performance, these cases should also help improve the balance of cases on the democracy variable. Eventually, I aim to work with a sample of 46 to 47 countries, which compared to Koopmans and Michalowski would considerably improve the statistical significance of the correlations that I intend to test. I'm not yet able to communicate a final list of countries, as I'm still in the process of identifying the cases where information and citizenship acquisition is more easily accessible. However, the criteria that I have presented here allow me to circumscribe a pool of countries on which I can search for empirical data, in particular in Africa, which until today remains a little bit of a blind spot in comparative analysis on citizenship. So to find data on these countries, I use 3 sets of sources. First of all, I rely on online comparative resources on citizenship legislations made available by global SIDs, such as the Global Database on Modes of Acquisition of Citizenship and the Global Nationality Laws Database. I also draw on country reports and secondary sources containing relevant information on my cases of interest. Unfortunately, data is sometimes missing to be able to cover the 7 indicators that feature in the MyPEX 2020 citizenship trend, and these are indicators on birthright citizenship, residence requirements for naturalization, language requirements, integration requirements, economic requirements, criminal records, and provisions on the renunciation of former citizenship. So where data is missing, I intend to both search for original documents presenting naturalization rules and rely on the help of regional or national experts, some of them participating in today's workshop and being very likely to hear from me soon. So this is the project that I'm working on. I hope that my presentation give you a good sense of what I have in mind, and I thank you for your attention and look forward to your feedback and questions.
Thank you so much, Emilien, and thank you for keeping to the time allocation perfectly. Now I would like to invite Isolde Honegan to comment on Emilien's paper in about 10 minutes. Isolde, please.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading Emilien's paper. Can you hear me all now? Good. I really enjoyed reading Emilien's paper, and I admire his project. I had lots of positive things to say about this. I think it's important to develop a global approach, and it's valuable to develop one that approaches citizenship acquisition in itself, because so many other indices combine citizenship acquisition with other aspects of immigrant integration, or other considerations. Or this in particular also addresses citizenship acquisition specifically through naturalization and birth through jus soli, rather than looking at a whole citizenship regime, which is important. But when the project is expanding to a global scope, and might be considered to be too ambitious, to focus on citizenship acquisition alone seems to me very valuable and worthwhile. And I also respect the fact that that Emilien is building on previous work rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, so that it is adding to and maybe making further nuances in previous work, which will allow participation in sort of the broad stream of research. I think this is really important. And I think also that because of the way in which he is addressing it, that there is a distinct qualitative and normative implications of what he is doing in terms of its democratic or inclusive or considerations with respect to justice and so forth for migrants and others. So all these things I think are really, really important and impressive. The work that he's done so far is very impressive. I suppose my comments will focus really on sections 2 and 3 of the paper about the measures of citizenship acquisition and case studies, selection of case studies, based largely on my experience of trying to develop the birthright citizenship indicators and to apply them in a global context, and the considerations that arose while we were trying to do this. Others will comment on the typologies and so forth, I'm sure, who are more expert in these matters. So just in terms of other dimensions, in the paper, Emilien discusses the aspects of naturalization provisions that he will, and conditions that he will include and those that he will exclude. And I broadly agree with those, that leaving implementation out is something that is practically important in any case, because these matters can be difficult. But I will come back to that again. Leaving special naturalization out and focusing on residence-based naturalization is worthwhile too. And I do think it's really important to include an account of the discrimination based on gender, race, group, and so forth. I think maybe he could have said a bit more about why he would include good health as the criterion. I felt that what exactly the basis for that could be just further explained, how it fits in with the others and is significant, rather than saying that it shouldn't be included. So I have, I suppose, 2 or 3 main points that I'd like to consider. And these, I suppose, the first one is concerned with what kinds of modification we need to make when we're expanding the scope of research globally. So in my own experience of the global birthright indicators, it meant quite a few modifications to the initial SIT law system, which had been developed with considerable thought and detail and nuance to capture a significant range of the obstacles to citizenship acquisition by birth. But at least for Europe in 2011 and 2013, we didn't have to code for explicit restrictions on the ground of gender, ethnicity, religion, or membership of particular groups. But these were common enough outside Europe to require systematic inclusion. So if we're considering expanding the scope of citizenship acquisition globally, it's important to consider the measures being applied, stemming initially from a more restrictive geographic focus, how these can lead to us to missing some significant elements. Now, Emilien has already taken a range of these things into account, but I'm wondering, and I'm just not sure about the answer to this, about birthright also. It's proposed to use the MIPEX account of jus soli, which is, I think, a three-part division of unconditional at birth, conditionally at birth, and after birth and by socialization. And these are important categories, and although the civil law categories are more disaggregated, these three categories seem useful and also normatively hierarchical in a way that is positive, I think. But I'm not sure whether the MIPEX categories include double jus soli, for example, citizenship based on birth in the country where the parent has also been born, or what I think is called now third generation, or jus soli sometimes. It's by no means a stronger form of jus soli, but it has been seen as playing some role in the inclusion of children of immigrants, at least as preventing generations of immigrants living in a country without being able to get citizenship in some European countries where it's been present. But in the global context, for example, it's found particularly in some African countries which otherwise don't have strong forms of jus soli. And that, if you're wanting to look at geographical scope and you want to take into consideration different forms and modifications, it might be important to see to what extent this measure takes any account of double jus soli. And I know that Giacomo Solano is here and might be able to say more about this later on, but I'm just not sure about that. From what I looked at, I wasn't sure. And I think that would be important from 2 points of view. First of all, to take account of global diversity, but also because you're trying to track in your fourth hypothesis, because you're trying to track colonial legacy. This is a very strong, mainly Francophone colonial legacy, mainly found in Francophone countries, and therefore it would be something which would pick up the colonial legacy in a way that would be important. And I suppose it's also true that in African countries where jus soli at birth is not strongly present, there's also a much stronger than in some other parts of the world, strong practice of jus soli after birth for children who have lived a number of years in the country. So the different patterns, this is something we've come across in looking at indicators, birthright indicators that we've been doing. If you look at, say, Africa from the point of view of looking just at jus soli at birth, straightforwardly, you don't see very strong jus soli. But if you look at the other modes of jus soli, you actually see a stronger presence of jus soli in Africa than there otherwise would appear. That's, I suppose, my first point. Question. The second point, I guess, is one about the choice of countries based on migration countries. And I understand the reasons why you're choosing migration countries with larger than 250,000 and a population of more than 5%. But it does seem to rule out a lot of important countries, and it also may rule out small countries that have migration that could be important to study for other reasons. Now, I haven't had the time to look and see, well, these countries could fall into two categories: ones that don't meet the 250,000 and ones that don't meet the 250,000 and don't meet the 5%. And if you could divide them into two categories, see would one of the criteria, presumably the 5% criterion, would there be countries that would survive the 5% criterion even if they didn't have 250,000 countries, migrants, like smaller countries that might be actually really interesting to study. So I would have a question about that. And I guess my final point probably really is one which is an aspiration, again, from my own experience in looking now back chronologically at now 20 years of birthright provision, is that the past is another country, and really to understand the nature of provision for citizenship acquisition, you learn a lot more about the present by looking at the past. And I know it's not possible immediately for your project to do this, but I think it would be really useful if the project could develop in a way that would be dynamic rather than looking at a snapshot at a point in time. I'm not sure if I've run out of my time at this stage, but I'll hand over to somebody else in any case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isol. Now, the second discussant of Emilian's paper is Martin Roos, whom I would also like to invite to comment in the next 10 minutes. Martin.
Yeah, hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Emilian, for inviting me to act as this discussant. I very much enjoyed reading the paper. I thought it was very well written, very clearly organized, and very thought-provoking. Now, my comments are obviously based on, strongly based on kind of my own experience with measuring not citizenship policies, but admission policies, specifically labor immigration admission policies, and the rights of migrant workers, what I call kind of recently admitted migrant workers. Anyway, I've been focusing on the kind of rights soon after arrival rather than the transition to citizenship. And so in a way, I suppose all my comments are made based on that experience. So my first comment, I suppose, is a stepping stone to the more substantive comment. It's more of a contextual point. And it's really about your first paragraph, where you basically say that measuring and comparing citizenship policies, acquisition is important because it matters for inclusion. And then, I mean, one general question that came to my mind, and I said it's kind of contextual one, is, what defines an inclusive society? And specifically, my point is about the role of permanent residents. I mean, the way I think about it in my own work, the way I think about rights is, you have this kind of transition over time. You have different statuses ranging from irregular, temporary, permanent to citizenship. And really in many countries, so at least in kind of many democracies, I think permanent resident gives you a large number of rights, almost all rights, except for the right to vote. And so, I mean, you might say this is beside the point because you're really focusing on acquisition of citizenship, but it might matter in terms of explaining variations potentially. And I saw that you had that in your list of potential indicators. But the meaning of the availability of permanent residence, how easy or difficult is it to get it, the substantive rights associated with it, I would expect that to matter for what it means to be a citizen. And this whole debate about devaluating citizenship and all of that, I think, might matter as well in kind of motivating your research. But again, I think this is more of a contextual point. Kind of the first more substantive point is it relates to the theory and hypothesis, which I thought were laid out very clearly. And again, kind of, I'm thinking this in terms of the kind of questions that I face. I suppose the question is, what kind of, I mean, how are policies made? What's the process that you have in mind? And of course, this is difficult because this might vary across countries. But I suppose, I mean, what you mention here are kind of some deep structural factors. Colonialism, the extent to which there is an experience of state secessionist movements, nation building. I mean, these are kind of historical factors that are clearly very important. But then there are also political regimes, which maybe change, the nature might change over time. But I suppose the question is, when you theorize your differences, what's the thinking about how citizenship policies are made? I mean, do these change very quickly? Are these kind of historically predetermined? The question is also relevant, where do you read of? I mean, these are all basic questions that will be maybe, well, people here will be very familiar with them, but I'm wondering, where do you read off these policies? I mean, do you look at constitutions? Is that where these policies are written, or are they written on websites? Again, with the kind of work that I've been doing, a lot of the policies that I've been looking at are written on websites. They're regulations that change very fast and very quickly, and in many countries without requiring a change of the law even. So that's why I had difficulty in kind of situating the hypothesis, because I was wondering, it might be impossible to come up with some sort of overall theory, also because there are country differences, but you have taken the route of kind of taking specific factors, kind of colonialism and other structural political regime, and kind of trying to see, testing that on its, almost on its own. I mean, you can, of course, put them together as well, but a little bit more contextualization of what kind of processes and theoretical framework there is behind the making of citizenship policies, I think would be helpful. And related to that is the question that I have. I mean, to what extent is the thinking here that these are instrumental policies? I mean, is there an instrumental element to it? I mean, clearly, again, I'm not the expert, but I would expect some instrumental role, right? Because so by that I mean that citizenship policies may be changed because there's a perception that the change might result in some good consequences, in some impact, whether it's economic or social or cultural, right? So if there is this instrumental thinking, is your idea then that these deep historical factors basically just circumscribe the policy space that there is in different countries for are these kind of constraints, or are those factors that are more than that? Now the third kind of brief comment on measurement. I mean, I don't want to say a lot because I mean there's a big debate. I agree with you on excluding naturalization rates, which to me seems to be an outcome indicator and is dependent on a lot of other things, including the motivation of individuals, of course. And we know that in many, I mean, in Europe, we know that EU nationals are less likely to naturalize because they have a lot of rights. EU nationals who live in member states other than where they were born. I also agree on kind of your caution on implementation. Even though I also take the point that there are countries who implement things very differently from the way things are written into the law, and this might make a big difference in practice actually. But I think the way to defend that is that you kind of look at policies on paper primarily and try to establish policy intent or maybe some sort of intent behind that. I mean, I don't think there's one right answer to how you kind of aggregate. I mean, there are statistical techniques that we know that I think often lack kind of some theoretical justification and kind of reducing the number of indicators we use. I mean, my kind of pretty basic response always is to be as transparent as possible and let people, put their own indicators together in any which way they think is right. So rather than saying this is the one way of doing it, these 6 indicators, equal weights or different weights, kind of allow people to, make available a database that actually allows people to create their own indicators, and you can create your own and justify it that way. I think that seems to be the most sensible way to me. 2 more quick points before I finish. The one is just that, unless I missed it, your paper doesn't talk much about, or not at all about, potential interrelationships between different components of these citizenship policies. So you're all about kind of explaining, kind of the overall scale of it, the inclusiveness of it. But I think it would be very interesting to see if there might be different patterns of kind of configurations of policies that and you might have some theories and hypotheses about those as well. And my final point is a point similar to the one that Essel made on how you define the countries in terms of numbers. I mean, this had actually escaped me when I was reading the draft, and so it's helpful that you mentioned it. I'm not quite sure why you're doing that at all, actually, because to me it seems that. So why are you considering the number of migrants at all in the country? Because, I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, to what extent, for example, the inclusiveness of citizenship acquisition policies, you would expect that to be related perhaps to the number of migrants in the country. I mean, I don't know, you could say in the Gulf states, I mean, apart from the fact that, they have certain political regimes, you could say the reason that they're not very inclusive is because if they were, then the current residents would become a very small minority. And so I would expect kind of a priori the numbers of migrants in the country to matter for the types of citizenship acquisition policy. So I think that would be an interesting question to look at. So I suppose my question is just why do you need to restrict it at all? There, I mean, we're not, I mean, there's a limited number of countries in the world, so you will be restricted by the information available. Anyway, for lots of countries, the information won't exist. I mean, there might be some reason for excluding some countries, but it's not clear to me why the number or share of migrants is is a good criterion. I'll leave it at that, but I really enjoyed it, and thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you, Martin, and also thanks to Isolt. I think, Emilienne, that they have provided you with a lot of food for thought. And I would like to invite you to address some of their comments briefly now before opening the floor to Q&A from the audience.
Thank you, Jelena, and thank you, Isolt and Martin, for these very stimulating comments. I think that I'll definitely need time to carefully examine them and trying to take them into account in my research design. Trying to respond to the points that Isolt made. So first of all, on W. Soli, but I think that Giacomo said something in the chat, so saying that MyPact considers jus soli at birth and jus soli after birth and focuses on the situation of children born on the territory to non-national parents. So I think that it's one of the contributions that Sam is making also in the Citrix indicator, in that he takes into account double jus soli provisions to measure more specifically the inclusivity of citizenship acquisition regimes compared to MyPact. So definitely it might be interesting to draw on different indices for different indicators that I intend to include in my index, given that on this particular case, on the number of years, not the number of years, sorry, on double jus soli provisions, it might make more sense to, well, use Citrix, because then, as you said, Isolt, we are able to cover more and important variations between cases. In terms of case selection, so it's true, yes, that I think that the immigration country test that I intend to use for my case selection risks leaving out countries that are interesting to study. And I mentioned the case of India, where, as we know, there have been there's been an intense politicization of citizenship in recent years. And well, this country, if I applied the immigration country test that Koopmans and Michałowski are also using, this country doesn't pass the test. So I was. It also relates to the point that Martin made, right? Whether the number of immigrants has any importance at all. So initially, I thought that, well, in countries where the number of immigrants is relatively important, politicians are likely to face pressures from the electorate that are largely similar. So I thought that, you know, it created a pool of countries that has some coherence in that sense. But well, it's true that there are pressures that are also exercised, perhaps in similar pressures from the electorate that are also exercised in countries where the number of immigrants is pretty low. So I think that I need to further consider this and perhaps find another criterion for in order to be more precise on this aspect. I was also wondering whether taking a longitudinal perspective on this variable, right, and the number of immigrants variable might make any sense, but I don't expect that there will be many changes over time in terms of the migration balance of the countries that I would look at. But well, it's just an assumption. So this is something that might be interesting also to consider more specifically. And the third question from Isolt, so yes, about taking a longitudinal perspective. It's something that is possible for some of the countries that I'd like to look at, but not for others. And it's definitely an aspiration that I share. And well, something that might be possible in the future, but unfortunately, we have to start from scratch for some countries. Now, moving on to Martin's comments. So, first of all, so a contextual point on permanent residence. And yes, this argument that it gives you many rights that are equivalent to citizenship rights in many countries. So it might be worth indeed to engage with this debate in my working paper. And initially, so I had in mind to incorporate the permanent residence process as part of the residence condition that is usually part of the naturalization process. So whether countries expect immigrants to have become permanent residents before applying for citizenship, but perhaps a more elaborate assessment of permanent residence, of access to permanent residence policies might be good. And in fact, the MyFact 2020 index includes a strand on permanent residence. So this is something that we can imagine that I should be able also perhaps to incorporate in the research design. Regarding the theory, so about how a policy is made, how do I conceive the elaboration of citizenship policies, and this idea that citizenship policies tend to change very quickly, given that, yes, they are often found in policy regulations that do not require any amendments in the law, any votes in parliament. It's a very interesting point, and actually, I think it relates also to the politics of citizenship as another variable that I'd like to incorporate in this research. So it might be something perhaps that I should consider for certain countries in my sample, because something that I'm not entirely sure at the moment is whether this argument on the politics of citizenship applies to all the countries in my sample, or only to the pool of countries that correspond to the categories that I have distinguished. So electoral democracies and liberal democracies, and also perhaps electoral autocracies. So yes, so whether citizenship regulations are found in constitutions, or whether they are found in policy regulations that can be changed very, very easily, it's definitely something important, I think. But well, the general assumption is that there are, and it's actually an hypothesis that I make in the paper, that there are long-term tendencies in citizenship laws, and this is why I think it's worth also to concentrate on these structural factors that are colonial legacies and political regimes. But well, it's something I think that I need to think more about. And so the last main comment on the dimensions of the aggregation of indicators, and the fact that I'm leaving out implementation from the dimensions of naturalization that I'd like to look at. Actually, I'm wondering whether there are dimensions of implementation that might be perhaps included in this project. For instance, if we think of the documentation that countries require from immigrants to provide. I don't know if it's unrealistic to expect. If it's unrealistic, yes, to try to cover this this dimension of the naturalization process. So it's something I'm still trying to figure out. About the interconnection.
Yeah, what kind of document is? I kind of missed what kind of document do you have in mind?
So all the documents that applicants need to provide, to prove that they satisfy the different requirements of the naturalization process. So, for example, I don't know, the criminal records that they need to provide, or how do they prove that they've resided for a certain number of years in the country? All these questions that were actually covered in the Cit-Imp index that Thomas Huddleston created for the European countries. So yes, it's a dimension of implementation that is, I think, important, and that might be perhaps incorporated as well. And finally, so about the interconnection between different modes of citizenship acquisition and perhaps loss of citizenship, so citizenship deprivation and denaturalization. I know that there were indicators on denaturalization in the previous version of MyPEX, and I think that yes, it would be interesting also to look for correlations between these different citizenship policies, especially perhaps in Western context, because there've been recent developments in citizenship stripping, and people are questioning whether there might be a correlation between the tightening that we've seen in naturalization policies and the inclusion of new provisions to facilitate citizenship stripping. So yes, it's something that is very important, and that I'd like to consider in more detail.
Thank you so much, Emilien. I see that we already have 4 hands raised. So I will take questions in order in which I have seen the hands. So Renee, Bronwyn, Sam, Reiner, and then Mark Helbling. And I would propose that we collect 2 questions per round and then give Emilien the chance to respond. Renee, please.
I think the microphone is off. So you just need to activate the microphone.
Yeah, no, it's activated. Thank you very much, Emilien, for the presentation of your fascinating project. And I think I can link my 3 observations immediately to your last words, where you also made the remark that perhaps it's good also to look to the deprivation. And I think it is precisely the deprivation based on committed fraud during the naturalization procedure, which may open the eyes for hidden naturalization conditions. I will give you 2 examples. The one example is the documents you have to submit in order to prove your identity. For example, in my own country, the Netherlands, one has the obligation to submit a birth certificate and a matching ID card or passport, national passport. And the most cases of identity fraud, of deprivation based on fraud, are cases of identity fraud where it is later on discovered that it was not your true name or other aspects of the identity. It is at the same time, this condition, the most frequent applied ground for the rejection of the naturalization. And why I stress that, it is not written in the Nationality Act. It is only written in the instructions given by the government, and that opens also confirms the remark of Martin Roos that it is very important to pay attention to these instructions. The second example is the good character example. There's a recent decision of the European Court of Human Rights of the 22nd of December 2020 in the case Usmanov against Russia, where again, the fraudulent acquisition of naturalization was the ground for the deprivation. And what do we see? In order to fulfill the condition of having a good character, one does not only to fill out whether there is a criminal record and to submit evidence of that, but one also has to submit information on the parents, and not only who the parents are, but the behavior of the parents and the siblings. And it was precisely the reason that Usmanov did not submit information on all his siblings, that later on Russia revoked the naturalization. And the European Court of Human Rights came to the conclusion that that is not proportional, and therefore Russia has to revise that. I let it with this.
Thank you so much, Renee. Bronwyn.
Thank you very much for your very interesting paper. I will start with, actually was the last thing I wrote down, but insistence on the importance of the documents you have to produce. All of these rules on naturalization are written in this fantasy world where everybody has a birth certificate and their parents' birth certificate and proof of existing nationality and proof of legal residence, and all of these things, none of which are in the slightest bit possible to prove or produce for most people in Africa. And it means that naturalization is available only to those people who are in the formal economy and have, $5,000 to spare in the context of Tanzania. But almost all of the naturalizations are several $100s, where we have information, which of course is not many places. So that I think the question of at least what documents do you have to produce, some of the other, which for some countries you can find out, albeit not for all, would be important to include. And I think the availability of a status of permanent residence is interesting to, lots of countries do not have a status of permanent residence, very few in Africa. And I think that is an interesting one to consider as well, because it at least provides a sort of stabilization zone between non-citizen to citizen. Coming back to my first question was, who is an immigrant? I want to know your definition of immigrant, because most of the international databases are born in another country, but you seem to be including people born in the country, which for me is not an immigrant. That is a person whose parents were immigrants. So I realize that different definitions are used in different contexts, but what is the definition that you are using? Because I started off thinking that this is about naturalization, but if you're including jus soli and especially double jus soli, by the time you get to double jus soli, you're really not talking about immigrants. You're talking about multiple generations born in the country. So I just want to understand more about what is your definition of immigrant, but also to pick you up on your question about, well, what do we do about India, which has low rates of immigration as a percentage of the overall population? Country as huge as India, I would suggest you look at sub-regional units. Assam has a large population of people of allegedly Bangladeshi descent, and some who are ethnically related to people in Bangladesh but are not themselves immigrants or even of immigrant origin. So you could just pick Assam and say, let me look at policy in Assam. But then how does the local regulation and procedure, the citizen tribunals, relate to national citizenship? So this relationship between the subnational and the national, procedurally, even if, of course, citizenship is a national level, which again relates to the collection of articles that Rainer and I edited, this relationship between the subnational and national, I think, is important about the percentage of immigrants that you have, but then also the definition of what is an immigrant. So the question of, so I'll leave that there. There's more I could say. On discretion and due process, all of the countries in Africa are equally totally discretionary when it comes to naturalization. It's completely within the decision of the minister or the president. There's no, but the the due process issues, which are slightly different, apply to the birthright citizenship questions. And so there's a very important distinction between, if you're getting to the birthright question, if you're including that in your data set, between those processes that are allegedly automatic attribution at birth and those require some level of discretion. And there is an important difference between the civil law and the common law countries, where even in the context of automatic attribution of birth, the common law countries, procedurally, it's within the Ministry of the Interior, and the courts don't have a role. If you're lucky, you can challenge in the courts, but it's not like the courts have you can go to court and get a certificate of nationality. So that the processes are different. But that question of is an application required or is it automatic attribution? That makes a massive difference in between the two jurisdictions. When it comes to naturalization, they're all equally arbitrary. And I think that's enough. I'll stop there. I could talk forever, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. I think that this has also provided Emilienne with a good starting point to address these first couple of questions, and then we will go ahead with Sam, Reiner, and then in the last round, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Renee and Bronwyn, for these comments and questions. So regarding, yes, Renee's observations on but related also to the importance of documentation and how do you prove your identity and how this also impacts citizenship deprivation policies once naturalization has been granted. So yeah, so I think that this proves once again the importance of looking at instructions regulating citizenship acquisition, and also the importance of documentation. So this relates to the first point that Bronwyn made, right, on the importance of documents in Africa, and the fact that yes, nationality regulations are made in this ideal world where everyone has papers. So it's actually something that I'm considering, and I don't know if it's perhaps too ambitious to have an indicator on documentation in such a large number of countries. Implementation. So I have a discussion on implementation in the working paper, and actually, apart from the difficulties to access data, to collect data, I don't see any strong argument, against the inclusion of implementation. Of course, it's really important, and I think that the point that you made, Bronwyn, shows how some dimensions, perhaps, of citizenship acquisition become more important once we move to a global perspective, right? So documentation, for example, is, as I understand, super important in Africa, and it might also perhaps be the case in Asia, because well, if I think, for example, the work of Kamal Sadiq on paper citizens, documentation matters in these countries. Perhaps, yes, this really reinforces the case, right, for indicators on this dimension. On the status of permanent residents, and the fact that it would be interesting to look at in Africa. So it's actually, yes, well, a question that I have, whether it's something that is mostly relevant in the Western world, or whether it makes any difference, beyond Western context. So, well, as I said, so I was thinking of including permanent residents in the residence condition for naturalization, but perhaps something more robust or more comprehensive might be needed on this particular process. My definition of immigrants, well, yes, so it's people who were not born in the country and who came to live in this country. So in that sense, I'm extending my research framework to descendants of immigrants and not immigrants themselves, because yes, I have this indicator on birthright citizenship. So it's not only naturalization, residence-based naturalization, because I also have indicators on this process, but it's broader in that sense that I'm also looking at this process based on birth. About the idea of including sub-regional units in India, I think it's super interesting, very relevant. And it relates also to, well, a question that I'm still thinking about in the development of this project about, you know, the divergences, the variations that we sometimes find in different countries at the local level. So I know that there are very important variations in some countries at the regional level. That might be, of course, ideally very interesting to look at, but yes, moving to such a large and comparative perspective, then it becomes harder to take them into account. But specifically, yes, so to look at sub-regional units and at the distribution of numbers in terms of immigration there for my case selection, I think it is very interesting. And yeah, well, thanks for your comments on common versus civil law, and yeah, the fact that it doesn't really make sense for naturalization, but more for birthright. So it's something that I will keep in mind.
Thank you so much, Emilienne. We will go now to the second round of questions. First, Sam, and then I see that Reiner has returned. So I will then give the floor to first Sam and then to Reiner.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thanks, Emilia. I'm very excited to see how this paper is progressing and coming along, because as you know, I already saw previous versions. I thought that overall, you would need a very clear argument and focus. For now, it's not very cohesive. It's a bit fuzzy. It seems like a compilation of various aspects. So you should be more clear about your aim and your argument. On some level, you say, well, I want to have a comprehensive explanation of citizenship policies, but what you actually do is focusing on very specific independent variables, and then you would have to statistically estimate their relative relevance, right? So you focus on historical and systemic roots. You don't focus on demographics. You don't focus on other issues. Of course, you will need control variables for which numbers of immigrants and there is data on foreign-born and qualifications have been mentioned by Brownman on how to define this, but you need to be pragmatic there. What do you have data for? What do you need to control to really investigate the variables you focus on? You also, I think, should be more clear about the mechanisms that link each variable to the policy outputs. It hasn't been very clear. For example, the hypothesis that democracies are more inclusive is intuitive, but you haven't really said what makes democracies, what causes this. And I think Martin has pointed out very well that you need to imagine some kind of micro level that links these macro level variables, right? I don't think that you need a full comprehensive conception of policy making, because you don't really have a dynamic perspective. And for a dynamic perspective, you would also need panel data to actually test the theory. So you could also use panel data to investigate relative levels. And also what would be interesting there would be to estimate the degree of path dependence. As we know, citizenship is strongly path dependent, but not fully inherent. So indeed, as Martin said, it's kind of a constraint on policy making. Although I don't think you need a full conception of policy making because it's not dynamic. So I wonder, probably cross-sectional data is valid for investigating differences in levels. And then I wonder, you know, why don't you just take MyPEX or take the Citrix global expansion that Martin has done, and about which I'm of course very excited. So we should really try not to proliferate with more indices and be restricted in your focus. So Citrix, for example, doesn't cover permanent residence as a precondition, because also the access to permanent residence differs very strongly. CITLAW in some versions does this, but it's very complex. So also the rights differential between permanent residence and citizenship, you could capture that, for example, with voting rights. But again, this is too much. This is not your focus. Deprivation covers loss. It's too much. It's not your focus. Subnational variation. It's too much. It's not your focus. So this would be my take on it. Also, if you use Citrix Global, you have liberalism as a scope condition, right? As Martin pointed out in the morning earlier. And if we compare political regimes, we need indicators that have cross-systemic validity. I will talk about this in my talk. And there we need to think of in terms of functional equivalence. So it doesn't matter whether those are constitutional provisions or laws, or whether there are functional equivalents in implementation and practice. If we want to compare it, we need to somehow subsume them under the same indicator. So we can ask, you know, are the indicators on the same dimension? Some indicators you have are more illiberal, some are more liberal. So you consider these, but then you could get a similar score for Austria, which is very exclusive but liberal, or for an inclusive but illiberal country. So you might want to have multiple dimensions. And there, another option could be, rather than an index, to construct a dependent variable that is categorical. So you could focus on configurations of policies, and then, for example, use multinomial regression to explain what category of configuration of policies a country is in. And there's also other techniques like Boolean logit, for example, that would allow you to model different pathways to the same outcome. So not additive causation, but different pathways to the same outcome, which is a more qualitative view on things, but there are statistical techniques. So these are a lot of comments and also very technical. And yeah, I'm sure you will proceed well with this, and I'm very happy to provide further feedback if you want.
Thank you so much, Sam. These were very useful comments, and I'm sure that there will be plenty of other opportunities for you and Emilian to discuss this. I know that Rainer had his hand up previously. So Rainer, please.
Yeah, well, it's difficult to add any questions to the big ones that Sam has just piled up. But in the same spirit, I have just 3 comments. All of them can be illustrated by the case of Austria, but I think they go beyond, and they apply probably to many other cases too. The first question is more about the dependent variable. You know, what you measure when you measure inclusiveness towards immigrants, and including second and third generations. The problem also with MyPEX is that it takes ordinary naturalization to mean the default mode for immigrant naturalization. In many countries, that's actually not the case. In Austria, the overwhelming majority of naturalizations of immigrants are not done under the ordinary naturalization procedure that requires 10 years, but under some forms of earlier naturalization after 6 years, either through spousal naturalization or because of special integration achievements or what have you. There are a number of other modes that apply, and they make up the big majority of current naturalizations. I know that this was also the case in Italy in the past. Most immigrants naturalized through spousal naturalization rather than ordinary naturalization. So by selecting just the ordinary naturalization, which is easier to compare, that's one reason, you may be missing out an important part of the actual naturalization processes that are open to immigrants, and especially also to second generations. Again, in Austria, second generations don't naturalized under the ordinary procedure, but under a 6 years procedure where all the other ordinary criteria also apply. My second and third comment are more on the independent variables and the hypothesis, very much on the same line as Sam started out on, which is you should make up your mind whether you want to comprehensively explain the inclusiveness of citizenship regimes, or whether you want to test whether those variables that you have selected contribute to the explanation, how much they contribute to it, meaning that you leave it open, that there may be other things that may be equally or more important that you don't capture. So you have these two sets of variables, one that measures trajectories of nation and state building, and the other one that measures quality of democracy, right? So for the trajectories, I think that is obviously important, but looking at your first hypothesis, which is about the legacy of secession or unification, I have already two questions. One is about unification. In Germany, the effect of unification was liberalization, not restrictiveness. It was finally overcoming the reasons for restrictiveness that existed as long as Germany was divided. So why would unification be expected to have the same effect as secession? Secondly, secession and maybe some forms of unification could be seen as a sufficient condition for some kind of ethno-national conception of citizenship, but they're certainly not it's certainly not a necessary condition. So, depending on how far you go back, whether you count, whether you take seriously Orban's claim that the Treaty of Trianon in 1920 is still the reason why Hungary has such an exclusive regime. I don't think that's a good explanation because, so many other countries had post-World War I treaties and didn't have the same kind of reaction. So there are other ways, other reasons why countries adopt ethno-national conceptions of citizenship that linger on as a legacy apart from a recent history of secession. And it may be important to think about how you could capture these, especially when you go to, East in Europe and in some other contexts where this is the prevalent pattern. And finally, the question about politics that you mentioned, I raised before. That's a very old hypothesis. Christian Jobke said, okay, it's left-wing governments that are more liberal and right-wing governments that are more restrictive. And there are ways to measure this. That's actually, if you do it in that simple way, you can just measure the color of the government in terms of the coalition composition or who is the dominant party in power. You could also refine it a little bit by looking who is the minister in charge of the citizenship portfolio and what is the party manifesto of the party that that minister belongs to. There are more difficult would be one thing that Sam tries to do, which is measure polarization on issues such as citizenship. How much is that something that the party system or the public is divided on? And what's the salience of that in public debates? And that's probably very, very difficult to do for a large N data set. But I think you just have to acknowledge and be aware that politics drives citizenship reforms in a major way. And citizenship reforms have become more volatile, meaning more frequent change, not because of the long-term trajectories studied by Brubeck and others, but because of the dynamics of politics that has made this such a salient issue in the debate between, the mobile and the immobile, the urban and the rural, the whole populist versus new liberal camps. There it has just become a symbolically very important issue how inclusive the citizenship regime is. And that is something that can be fairly independent of whatever the historic origins of the regime were.
Thank you so much, Rainer. I think in the interest of time, we should move directly to Mark Helbling.
Yeah, thanks. I think I can be brief because I just want to echo maybe some of the comments that have been raised already. Regarding the independent variables, I would also say, especially given the fact that you go beyond the cases we have studied so far, I think the best or most interesting strategy would be to basically test all the hypotheses we already have in the field to see to what extent the factors that have been proven to play a role in, you know, like, let's say, developed countries also play a role in other countries. I thought, in a way, this reminded me a little bit of a debate we had maybe 10 years ago about the question whether citizenship is past dependent or not, and to what extent. And there were big camps that had different opinions on that. And I think in the end, it's just an empirical question. I don't see why you would leave out important variables like political parties that have been studied recently. I mean, Katharina Natter, Philip Lutz studied this. Samuel Schmidt also has this in his analysis. So I would just include that there. Also, I mean, in a way, Mark Howard's book was interesting in that regard because he included both kinds of variables. And he had this argument, which I found a little bit weird, that he wanted to explain like the situation in the 1980s at the beginning of his period of investigation with the long-term factors, and then the time afterwards with the short-term factors. So, but at least, I mean, he also tried to combine this. And then I also like to emphasize Martin's point about the selection of countries. I don't see, or I think maybe even a problem to have only immigration countries for reasons that have been mentioned already, but also because it leads to some other biases, because it might be that you then have the more democratic countries in your sample. And that's what actually you have shown us with your sample selection. As migrants know, not just randomly migrate to some countries, but try to go to some richer or more democratic countries, and that might actually explain why you end up with more democratic countries in the end. And I think the saliency of immigration is a potentially a crucial factor to understand the restrictiveness of citizenship policies.
Thank you so much, Mark. Emilienne, I would turn it over to you now to address some of these issues. I know that this is plenty of material for thinking, a lot of questions, but if you could address them in 2 to 3 minutes, I would be most grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena. So yeah, that's a challenge. I'll try to be brief. Well, thanks to the three of you for these comments. Perhaps starting with Mark. So, and actually it relates to other comments that were made by Samuel and Rainer. I think that I need to develop the theoretical framework as far as a conception of past dependency and long-term determinant factors are likely to affect citizenship policies, and also make it clearer that I have this cross-sectional perspective and no dynamic perspective, which relates to the points that were made by Sam, that perhaps I want to take too many things into account, and that having a clearer idea of the perspective and the contribution that I want to make will help in this respect. So the point that you made, Mark, on immigration countries and the other observations that were made in this point makes me think that it might be worth to, yes, do not use this immigration countries as for case selection, but perhaps use it as an independent variable, see whether this affects the inclusivity of citizenship acquisition regimes at all. Then, yeah, so regarding the politics of citizenship, which relates to a point that was made by Rainer and also Sam, I'm actually, yes, not entirely sure at this point as far as the methods that I want to use to test the different theories, so the variables that I have in mind. And I'm currently considering perhaps using qualitative comparative analysis for this project, because, well, as you said, Sam, I think that it has many advantages in terms of equifinality, the fact that you can look for different paths to the same outcome, and that I might be able also to differentiate my hypothesis, depending on the groups of countries that I consider, right, and perhaps also be more specific in the results that I will reach. So this is something that I'm currently considering, and well, yeah, I look forward to new discussions to continue to develop this project.
Thank you so much, Emilienne. And once again, I would like to thank everyone who participated. Major thank you to Isolt and Martin, who provided Emilienne with comments on his current work. We will have a lunch break now, and we will reconvene here at 3 p.m. for the second panel of today's conference. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.